The Montana air in the spring was thick with the promise of new life. For Wyatt Coleman, that promise had a name: Rosemary. He'd sanded the floors of his cabin until the pine bled gold, built a bookshelf for books she hadn't yet brought, and set 2 places at a table that had only ever known one. He was a man who had carved a life from dirt and timber with his own 2 hands, but the silence of his success had become a deafening roar. Today the stagecoach was coming. Today the silence would end. But when he returned to his cabin under the shadow of the mountains, he found the silence had transformed into something far, far worse. Wyatt Coleman was not a man given to flights of fancy. His world was one of solid, tangible things: the heft of an axe, the warmth of the sun on his neck, the unyielding strength of the Douglas firs that bordered his land. His ranch, the Coyote Creek Claim, was a testament to 10 years of brutal solitary labor. He had arrived in the Montana Territory with little more than a strong back and a stubborn refusal to fail. Now he had 100 head of prime cattle, a cabin that stood firm against the winter's rage, and a deed signed and sealed to 1,000 acres of the finest grazing land this side of the Bighorn Mountains. But the land, for all its beauty, was a silent partner. The wind whispering through the lodgepole pines offered no conversation, and the creek babbled in a language he couldn't understand. At 35, the solitude that had once been a shield had become a cage. His hands, calloused and capable, knew how to mend a fence and birth a calf, but they felt clumsy and empty in the quiet evenings. That was why he had done it. He'd written the letter. He had seen the advertisement in a month-old copy of the St. Louis Chronicle that a fellow rancher had left at the general store in Prairie Ridge. Matrimonial Bureau, it read. Respectable gentlemen of the West seeking pious and hardy wives. It felt like a fool's errand, a desperate move for desperate men. But as he sat alone watching the sun bleed out behind the distant peaks, he realized he was in fact a desperate man. His correspondence with Miss Rosemary Dunn of Jefferson City, Missouri, had been the most terrifying and exhilarating experience of his life. Her letters were penned in a delicate yet firm hand. She wrote of her desire for a new beginning, away from the crowded, coal-dusted streets of the city. She didn't write of romance, but of partnership, of building something together. She was the daughter of a school teacher, orphaned a year prior, and possessed, in her words, a practical nature and a strong constitution. For 6 months, their letters crossed the vast expanse of the nation. He sent her a photograph of himself, squinting in the harsh sun, looking more severe than he felt. She sent one in return, a serious young woman with wide, intelligent eyes, and hair pulled back so tightly it seemed to defy gravity. She was not a classic beauty, but there was a strength in her gaze that called to him a promise of resilience that he understood better than any flowery prose. He sent her the train fare and the stagecoach ticket. Her last letter had arrived 2 weeks ago, its date of arrival circled on his calendar with a piece of charcoal, May 12th, 1888. Today was the day. The cabin was immaculate. Wyatt had spent the previous evening scrubbing the floorboards with lye soap until they shone. He'd aired out the quilts, cleaned the soot from the lantern glass, and even placed a small chipped vase on the mantelpiece, filled with the hardy purple wildflowers that grew near the creek. He had slaughtered a chicken and had potatoes ready for roasting. A new rocking chair, its wood still pale and smelling of fresh shavings, sat near the hearth, a mirror to his own worn one. He looked at his reflection in the small, warped mirror he'd hung by the door. He'd trimmed his beard and combed his dark hair with water. He wore his best shirt, faded from the sun but clean and mended. He felt a nervous flutter in his gut, a feeling so foreign he almost mistook it for illness. "Wyatt Coleman, you old fool," he murmured to his reflection, his voice a low rumble. He took one last look around the cabin. 2 chairs, 2 plates on the table. A second peg hammered into the wall for a coat he had never seen. The entire space seemed to be holding its breath, waiting. He was waiting. He stepped outside, pulled the heavy wooden door shut, and slid the bolt across. It was a habit born of years alone, though the only thieves out here were the 4-legged kind. He saddled his buckskin mare Bess, her familiar movements, a small comfort in the churning sea of his anxiety. The ride to Prairie Ridge was 10 miles. He pushed Bess at a steady clip, the rhythm of her hooves, a drumbeat marking the final moments of his solitude. The sky was a vast, unforgiving blue, the sun a white-hot coin. He passed the sprawling lands of the Higgins Cattle Company, a stark contrast to his own modest claim. Bartholomew. Bart Higgins was a man who measured his worth in land and livestock, and he owned most of both in this valley. Higgins had made several offers for Wyatt's land, drawn by the year-round flow of Coyote Creek. Wyatt had refused every time. A man's first claim was his soul, and his wasn't for sale. As he neared the small, dusty collection of buildings that constituted Prairie Ridge, his heart began to pound against his ribs. The stagecoach was due in an hour until his life, a life defined by the singular pronoun, I might finally learn the meaning of we. He imagined her stepping down from the coach, tired and dusty from the journey. He would take her bags, his hand might brush hers, and he would say, "What welcome, Miss Dunn." It sounded too formal. Rosemary. Too familiar. He shook his head, a wry smile touching his lips. He could build a cabin from raw timber, but couldn't fashion a simple greeting. He dismounted in front of the livery, handing the reins to a young stable boy. He walked down the town's single dusty street towards the Wells Fargo office, his boots kicking up small clouds of alkali dust. The saloon was already noisy. The blacksmith's hammer rang a steady rhythm, and a few townsfolk nodded to him. He was respected, if not well known. A quiet man who paid his debts and kept to himself. He checked his pocket watch. 20 minutes to go. 20 minutes until the future arrived on 4 wheels pulled by 6 tired horses. He found a spot on a bench in the shade, his back against the rough-hewn wall of the general store, and he began the longest wait of his life. The stagecoach was late. An hour bled into 2. The sun arced across the sky, beating down on the dusty street and baking the life from the air. Wyatt remained on the bench, his initial anxiety curdling into a knot of cold dread in his stomach. He'd seen stagecoaches break axles, throw wheels, or be delayed by lame horses. It happened. But every scenario his mind conjured felt thin and unsatisfying. Finally, a shout went up. "Coach!" Wyatt shot to his feet, his joints stiff. Down the long, dusty road, a plume of dust announced its arrival. The familiar shape of the Concord stagecoach grew larger, swaying and rattling as it approached. His heart resumed its frantic hammering. He smoothed the front of his shirt, a useless gesture that did nothing to calm his nerves. The coach lumbered to a halt in a chorus of creaking leather and blowing horses. The driver, a weathered man named Peterson, whom Wyatt knew by sight, wrapped the reins and climbed down, stretching his back. 2 passengers emerged, a portly salesman in a rumpled suit and a tired-looking woman with 2 small children in tow. Wyatt waited. He scanned the dark interior of the coach, expecting to see her, the woman from the photograph. But no one else emerged. The driver began unstrapping the luggage from the roof. "That's all?" Wyatt asked, his voice rougher than he intended. Peterson glanced at him, wiping sweat from his brow with the back of a dusty glove. "That's it, Coleman. Just the Hendersons and old Mr. Abernathy here." "I was expecting someone," Wyatt said the words, feeling heavy and foolish in his mouth. "A lady." Miss Rosemary Dunn. From Jefferson City. Peterson scratched his grizzled jaw. Dunn, nope. No one by that name on my passenger list. Not from this stop, not from the one before. We came all the way from Bozeman, and she wasn't on it. The knot of dread in Wyatt's stomach tightened into a cold, hard stone. Are you sure maybe she used a different name? The list is the list, Peterson said, shrugging. Sorry, friend, maybe she's on tomorrow's coach. But her letter had been specific. May 12th. Today. Disappointment, sharp and bitter, washed over him. He felt the eyes of the few people milling about their curiosity, pricked by his anxious waiting. He felt like a public fool. He gave a curt nod to Peterson, turned on his heel, and strode back towards the livery. All that preparation. The clean cabin, the second chair, the wildflowers, all for nothing. The ride home was a torment. Every hoofbeat of his mare seemed to mock him. Fool. 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 He imagined 1,000 reasons for her absence. Perhaps she had lost her nerve. Perhaps she'd taken one look at a map, at the vast emptiness surrounding a place called Prairie Ridge, and decided against it. Or perhaps she had met someone else, a man in a fine suit on the train, and had been swayed by promises of an easier life. The thought brought a surprising pang of anger. By the time he reached the turnoff to his own land, the sun was low in the sky, painting the clouds in violent strokes of orange and purple. A profound sense of desolation settled over him, heavier than any winter snow. The cabin, which had been a beacon of hope that morning, now looked like a monument to his own foolishness. He dismounted his body, aching with a weariness that had little to do with physical labor. He didn't bother to unsaddle Bess immediately, letting her drink from the trough. He walked towards the cabin, his boots heavy as lead. That's when he noticed it. The door. It was slightly ajar. Wyatt froze. He distinctly remembered sliding the heavy wooden bolt home. He never left his cabin unlocked. A prickle of unease ran up his spine. Had a drifter wandered in looking for food? Or worse. "Hello," he called out, his voice swallowed by the immense silence. No answer. He pulled the hunting knife from the sheath on his belt, the familiar weight of the steel a small comfort. He pushed the door open slowly. The interior of the cabin was awash in the dim, dusky light of the dying day. The first thing he saw was the overturned chair. One of the new kitchen chairs he had painstakingly assembled. It lay on its side near the center of the room. His eyes followed a line from the chair upwards into the gloom of the rafters. And then he saw her. For a moment, his mind refused to process the image. A shape suspended in the air, turning ever so slightly in the draught from the open door. A woman. Her feet, clad in simple, sensible shoes, dangled a foot above the floor. A rope, new and thick, was knotted around a high ceiling beam, and then around her neck. His breath hitched in his throat. His blood ran cold. He took a staggering step forward, and then another until he was standing almost directly beneath her. It was the woman from the photograph. Her hair, a cascade of dark auburn, had come loose from its tight bun. Her face, pale and bloodless in the twilight, was tilted at an unnatural angle. Her wide, intelligent eyes were open, staring at nothing. She wore a simple grey travelling dress, now horribly rumpled. It was Rosemary Dunn. She had arrived after all. The world tilted on its axis. The air in the cabin was thick, suffocating. He saw the table still set for two. He saw the wildflowers in the vase on the mantel. He saw the second rocking chair waiting patiently for its occupant. And he saw her, the woman who was supposed to be his future, hanging from his own rafters, a ghost before she ever had a chance to be a wife. A guttural sound tore from Wyatt's throat, a sound of pure animalistic agony. It was a sound of hope being murdered, of a dream being strangled. He stumbled backward, his legs giving out, and fell to the floor, his eyes fixed on the gentle, horrifying pendulum of the body in the center of his home. The moon was high and cold by the time Sheriff Brody Kent arrived. He was a tall, stooped man in his late 50s, with a face like a worn map, and eyes that had seen too much to be surprised by anything. Flanking him was his young deputy Finn Riley, whose face was still smooth, with a nervous energy that hadn't yet been ground out of him by the grim realities of his job. Wyatt was sitting on his porch steps when they rode up a blanket wrapped around his shoulders, though he didn't feel the chill. He hadn't moved since he'd staggered out of the cabin, the image of Rosemary seared onto the inside of his eyelids. He just sat, staring into the darkness, the silence of his ranch now filled with a terrible screaming void. "Coleman," the sheriff said, his voice a low, gravelly sound as he dismounted. "What in God's name happened here?" Wyatt didn't look at him. He just pointed a trembling finger toward the cabin door. "In there." Sheriff Kent exchanged a look with his deputy, then pulled a lantern from his saddlebag. He lit it, the yellow glow pushing back the oppressive darkness, and stepped inside. Deputy Riley followed his hand, resting on the butt of his pistol. Wyatt heard the deputy's sharp intake of breath, followed by a muttered curse. He heard the sheriff's heavy footsteps on the wooden floorboards, the creak of the rope, and then a long, heavy silence. After what felt like an eternity, Kent emerged, his face grim. "Cut her down, Finn," he said quietly. "Gently now." He walked over and sat on the step next to Wyatt, the lantern placed between them, casting long, dancing shadows. He didn't speak for a full minute, just stared out at the dark shapes of the mountains. "You find a note?" Kent finally asked. "No." Wyatt croaked, his throat raw. "You were expecting her today, weren't you? Heard you waiting in town." "She wasn't on the stage," Wyatt said numbly. "I came back and found her. Like that." He couldn't bring himself to look at the sheriff. The shame of it was a physical weight, as if her death in his home was his own personal failure. "Look straight forward," Kent sighed, rubbing the back of his neck. "Young woman comes 1,000 miles to marry a man she's never met to a life she can't imagine. Takes one look and loses her nerve. It's a tragedy, Wyatt. A damned tragedy. But it happens." Wyatt shook his head, a small, defiant movement. "No, not her. Her letters. She was strong. Practical. People ain't always what they seem in letters," the sheriff countered gently. Deputy Riley came out of the cabin, his face pale in the lantern light. "We got her down, Sheriff. Laid her on the bed." "Go through her things," Kent ordered. "Carefully. Look for a letter, anything that might tell us why." As Riley went back inside, Kent leaned closer to Wyatt. "Tell me everything. From the beginning." Wyatt recounted the story, his voice a monotone. The advertisement, the letters, the photograph, the long wait, the empty stagecoach, the return to the cabin. He described the jolt of seeing the unbolted door, the overturned chair, the final, horrific discovery. Kent listened patiently, his gaze fixed on Wyatt's face. "The rope," he said, when Wyatt had finished. "Did you recognize it?" "It's from my barn," Wyatt admitted, his stomach twisting. "A new coil I bought last month." And the chair was kicked over. It was on its side, right underneath her. It all pointed to one simple, ugly conclusion. But something was wrong. It felt wrong, like a poorly told lie. "She couldn't have," Wyatt whispered more to himself than to the sheriff. "Why would she come all this way? How did she even get here if she wasn't on the coach?" That question hung in the air, heavy and unanswered. Riley reappeared at the doorway. "Sheriff, you should see this." Kent stood up and walked back inside. Wyatt following him as if pulled by an invisible string. He had to force himself to look. Rosemary was lying on his bed, her form covered by a clean sheet Riley had found. The cabin felt alien, desecrated. On the small kitchen table, Riley had laid out the contents of a single small carpet bag, a change of clothes, a brush, a well-worn Bible, and a small bundle of letters tied with a ribbon. Wyatt recognized his own handwriting. "No note," Riley said. "Nothing. But look at this." He pointed to the floor near where the chair had been. In the lantern light, a small dark smudge was visible on the floorboards Wyatt had scrubbed so meticulously. Kent knelt down, rubbing it with his finger and sniffing it. "Cigar ash," he said, his brow furrowed. "Do you smoke cigars, Wyatt?" "Never," Wyatt said. "Pipe sometimes, but never a cigar." Kent stood and walked over to the body on the bed. He hesitated, then gently pulled back the sheet from her head and neck. The rope had left a brutal, deep contusion. He examined her hands. "Her fingernails are clean," he murmured. "No splinters. You'd expect a woman to fight, to grab at the rope, to claw at the chair or the beam. Something, even if she was determined." He then did something that made Wyatt's stomach clench. He leaned in, close to her face, his own almost touching hers. He stayed like that for a long moment, then straightened up his expression, unreadable. "What is it?" Wyatt demanded. "Faint smell," the sheriff said, his eyes distant. "Whiskey, and that same cigar smoke on her dress." He looked around the cabin. "Where's your whiskey bottle?" "On the shelf by the stove. It's nearly full. I barely touch it." Kent walked over, picked up the bottle and uncorked it, taking a small sniff. He shook his head. "Not this. This is cheap rye. What I smell on her is different. Better quality. Irish, maybe." He turned his gaze back to the body, then to the rope still hanging from the rafter. He walked over to it, examining the knot. "Finn," he said, "come look at this knot. You were a sailor before you pinned on that badge. What do you make of it?" The deputy came over and craned his neck, studying the knot tied to the beam. "It's a hangman's noose, sure enough. But the hitch on the beam, that's a highwayman's hitch. It's a quick-release knot. You pull the free end, and the whole thing comes undone instantly. Not the kind of knot you'd tie if you wanted to make sure it held your own weight." A thick silence descended on the cabin. The suicide theory, so simple and plausible just minutes before, was starting to unravel. Cigar ash, the scent of expensive whiskey, a quick-release knot. Sheriff Kent finally looked at Wyatt, his eyes sharp and serious. "Someone was here, Coleman. Someone who smokes cigars, drinks Irish whiskey, and knows his knots." He paused, his gaze sweeping the room before landing on Wyatt again. "And someone who wanted this to look like your mail-order bride took her own life." He then asked the question that would ignite the fire of Wyatt's rage. "Tell me, son, who besides you knew she was coming today, and who benefits most from you staying a lone rancher?" Wyatt's mind instantly flew to the sprawling fields of the Higgins Cattle Company, the fat, arrogant face of Bart Higgins, and the relentless offers for the land under his feet. The land with the water. The land Higgins needed to expand his empire. Grief was a cold, empty cavern in his chest. But now, for the first time, a hot, bright flame of fury flickered to life within it. The sun rose the next morning on a world that had been irrevocably broken. Sheriff Kent and Deputy Riley had taken Rosemary's body back to town, wrapped in one of Wyatt's blankets. The official verdict for now was suicide pending further investigation, but Kent's final words to Wyatt had been a quiet warning. "Don't do anything foolish. Let me handle this." Foolishness, however, felt like the only sane response. Wyatt couldn't stay in the cabin. Her ghost was in every corner, in the empty chair in the rope-scarred rafter beam. He spent the night in the barn, the smell of hay and leather, a small comfort, but he did not sleep. The image of her haunted him, and the sheriff's questions echoed in his mind. Who benefits? There was only one answer. Bart Higgins. Wyatt saddled Bess with grim determination. He didn't bother with his gun belt. This wasn't a duel. It was an accusation. Prairie Ridge was already stirring with the news. As Wyatt rode down the main street, conversations quieted. People stopped and stared. He saw pity in some eyes, suspicion in others. The whispers followed him like flies. His mail-order bride found her hanging, couldn't face the hard life. The town had already written the story, and it was the one Sheriff Kent had first proposed. A simple, sad story of a fragile woman from the East. It was easier than believing a monster walked among them. He found Higgins holding court on the porch of the Prairie Ridge Grand Hotel, the only two-story building in town which he owned. Higgins was a bull of a man, with a thick neck that strained the collar of his expensive shirt, and a face florid from too much food and whiskey. He was flanked by two of his foremen, hard-faced men with guns on their hips. Coleman! Higgins boomed, a humorless smile stretching his lips. Heard about your tragedy. My condolences. A terrible business. Was it Higgins? Wyatt said, his voice low and tight. He stopped at the bottom of the hotel steps, forcing Higgins to look down at him. Or was it just business? Higgins's smile vanished. What the hell is that supposed to mean? You've been after my claim for a year. That creek is the only thing stopping you from doubling your herd. You knew that woman's arrival meant I was setting down permanent roots, that I'd never sell. One of the foremen stepped forward. Watch your mouth, rancher. Wyatt didn't even glance at him. His eyes were locked on Higgins. Where were you yesterday afternoon, Higgins? Higgins let out a short, sharp laugh. Are you accusing me of something? You got sand, I'll give you that. As it happens, I was in the saloon from noon until sundown, playing poker with half the town council and losing magnificently. Ask any of them. Ask Maeve O'Connell, who owns the place. She was pouring my drinks all afternoon. The perfect alibi. Public ironclad, and delivered with the smug certainty of a man who knew he was untouchable. Your bride took one look at that dirt scratch patch you call a ranch and took the easy way out, Coleman. Higgins sneered, his voice dripping with condescension. Don't try to lay your bad luck at my door. Rage pure and white-hot flooded Wyatt's vision. He took a step up, his hands balling into fists. Higgins's foremen immediately drew their pistols. That's enough. A sharp voice cut through the tension. Sheriff Kent was standing not 10 feet away, his expression unreadable. Go home, Wyatt. Now. Defeated Wyatt backed away, the burning glare he shot at Higgins, promising that this was not over. He turned and walked away, the sound of Higgins's mocking laughter following him down the street. He didn't go home. He went to the saloon. The Ace High Saloon was quiet in the morning, smelling of stale beer and old regrets. Maeve O'Connell was behind the bar, a formidable Irishwoman with fiery red hair, pinned in a tight bun, and eyes that missed nothing. She was wiping the bar with a damp cloth. He'll have a whiskey, Maeve said to the empty room as Wyatt approached. She poured a generous measure of rye into a clean glass and pushed it towards him. On the house. He was here, Wyatt asked, his voice hoarse. Higgins, all afternoon. Maeve stopped her wiping and leaned on the bar, her expression softening with something that looked like pity. He was Wyatt. Sat at that corner table from just after lunch till well past supper, loud, arrogant, and drinking my best stock, him and his cronies. Brodie Kent already came by and asked. It was a dead end. Wyatt downed the whiskey in one gulp, the burn in his throat a welcome distraction. "The whole town's talking," Maeve said quietly, her voice losing its professional edge, "saying she was delicate." "She wasn't," Wyatt said fiercely. "She was strong." "I believe you," Maeve said, and he knew she meant it. "But that ain't the story people will tell." She paused, then lowered her voice even more, leaning closer. "Wyatt, there's something else. The stagecoach driver Peterson. He's a gossip. But yesterday morning, one of Higgins's men, a wrangler I don't know by name, was in here asking about him, asking if he was a man who could be persuaded. To lose a passenger, maybe, or deliver them to the wrong address." Wyatt stared at her. "What did you say?" "I told him Peterson was as straight as they come. The man just grunted and left. I didn't think nothing of it at the time. It was a thread, a thin, frayed thread, but it was something. Higgins had an alibi for the time of death, but that didn't mean he hadn't set the wheels in motion." "There's more," Maeve added, her eyes darting towards the door. "Yesterday. It was morning before the stage was due. A private wagon came through town, a buckboard with a canvas cover. Just a driver and one passenger, a woman. She kept her face hidden with a bonnet, but she was wearing a grey dress. They didn't stop. They just passed through, heading west. Towards your claim." The air left Wyatt's lungs. "A private wagon. Are you sure?" "As sure as I'm standing here," Maeve confirmed. "The driver was a stranger, rough-looking fellow. I remember thinking it was odd. Most folks wait for the stage. She hadn't come on the stagecoach because she was already here. Someone had intercepted her, picked her up before she ever got to Prairie Ridge, and driven her directly to his cabin. Driven her to her death. This was no suicide. This was an execution planned and carried out with brutal efficiency, and Bart Higgins, despite his airtight alibi, was at the heart of it. Wyatt placed a coin on the bar, his mind racing. "Thank you, Maeve." "Be careful, Wyatt," she warned, her voice laced with genuine concern. "Higgins is a snake, and you're kicking the nest." As he stepped back out into the harsh sunlight, the grief remained a constant aching weight. But now it was accompanied by something else, purpose. He wasn't just a grieving fool anymore. He was a hunter, and he would find the man who drove that wagon. For 2 days, Wyatt rode a grim circuit of the valley's homesteads and ranches, asking about a stranger in a buckboard wagon. He was met with suspicion and closed doors. The story of the suicidal bride had taken root, and his questions made him seem like a man crazed by grief, unwilling to accept the truth. He was an outcast, chasing shadows that no one else could see. He was beginning to lose hope when on the 3rd day, a man rode into Prairie Ridge who changed everything. Wyatt was at the livery paying the stablemaster for a bag of oats when the stranger arrived. He was not a cowboy or a rancher. He wore a dark city suit, dusty from the road, but clearly expensive, and a bowler hat. He dismounted from a fine-looking sorrel with a fluid grace that spoke of long hours in the saddle belying his citified appearance. He was of medium height, with a neat brown mustache and unsettlingly calm grey eyes that seemed to take in everything at once. The man approached Sheriff Kent, who was just leaving his office. They spoke for several minutes, the stranger showing the sheriff a small leather wallet from his coat pocket. Kent's posture stiffened, and he nodded slowly, his expression growing more serious with every word the man spoke. Then, to Wyatt's surprise, the sheriff pointed directly at him. The stranger walked over his boot heels, making sharp, decisive sounds in the dust. "Mr. Wyatt Coleman?" he asked. His voice was level without the western drawl Wyatt was used to. It was the voice of a man from back east. "Who's asking?" Wyatt replied, his tone wary. "My name is Leland Pike. the man said, extending a hand. Wyatt hesitated before shaking it. Pike's grip was firm and dry. I'm an operative with the Pinkerton National Detective Agency. The name sent a jolt through Wyatt. Pinkertons. They were lawmen for hire detectives, famous for hunting train robbers and breaking up outlaw gangs. What could a Pinkerton possibly want in a backwater town like Prairie Ridge? I've come from St. Louis. Pike continued, his grey eyes studying Wyatt intently. I'm here about a woman named Catherine Gable. I believe you knew her as Rosemary Dunn. Wyatt's mind reeled. Catherine Gable, her name was Rosemary. Rosemary Dunn was the name she adopted to start a new life. Pike corrected him gently. Her real name was Catherine. She was the head bookkeeper for a shipping consortium in St. Louis, and she was the star witness in a federal case against her employer, a man named Franklin Thorne. Wyatt stared at him, utterly bewildered. Bookkeepers. Federal cases. This was a world away from cattle and barbed wire. Thorne, Pike explained, was embezzling hundreds of thousands of dollars. Catherine discovered the scheme, and being a woman of considerable principle, went to the authorities. Thorne is a powerful man with dangerous connections. When he was indicted, Catherine knew her life was in danger. She was placed in a witness protection program of a sort. The plan was for her to disappear, to become someone new, somewhere no one would ever think to look for her. Here, Wyatt breathed the pieces, clicking into place with sickening clarity. She was coming here. Precisely, Pike confirmed. The matrimonial bureau was our idea, a way to give her a new identity and a new life that was completely plausible. We vetted you, Mr. Coleman. We found you to be an honest, hard-working man, isolated and with no ties to the criminal underworld. You were the perfect stranger to build a new life with. You were her safe harbor. The irony was a physical blow. He was meant to be her protector, and she had been murdered in the very home that was supposed to be her sanctuary. When she failed to send her scheduled check-in telegram upon arrival, Pike said, his voice grim, I was dispatched to investigate. Sheriff Kent has just informed me of the tragic outcome. They're calling it a suicide, Wyatt said, his voice thick with anger. The whole town believes it. It was not a suicide, Pike stated with absolute certainty. Catherine Gable was not a woman who would ever take her own life. She was a fighter. More importantly, Franklin Thorne would not leave her existence to chance. He would have sent someone to silence her permanently. Here at last was an ally, someone who saw the truth. I think I know who he sent, Wyatt said, his gaze hardening, or who he hired locally, a man named Bartholomew Higgins. Pike raised an eyebrow. The cattle baron Sheriff Kent mentioned him. Said he wanted your land. It's more than that, Wyatt insisted. He quickly told Pike everything. Higgins's relentless offers, the focus on his creek's water rights, the convenient alibi, the whispers Maeve had overheard about hiring the stagecoach driver and the sighting of the private wagon. Pike listened without interruption, his calm grey eyes never leaving Wyatt's face. When Wyatt was finished, the detective nodded slowly. This Thorne back in St. Louis. Pike mused. His shipping company's biggest client, the one he used to launder most of the stolen money, was a beef-packing plant in Omaha, a plant that is majority owned by the Higgins Cattle Company. The final piece slammed into place. It wasn't just about the land and the water. It was a conspiracy that stretched 1,000 miles from the corrupt boardrooms of St. Louis to the dusty plains of Montana. Higgins hadn't just been trying to acquire Wyatt's land. He had been contracted by his business partner Thorne to eliminate the one person who could send them both to prison. So the driver of that wagon, Wyatt began, was most likely the killer. Pike finished for him. He intercepted Miss Gable before she reached town, likely convincing her he was a friend sent by you for her safety and comfort. He drove her to your isolated cabin, a place where no one would hear her scream, and he murdered her. Then he staged it to look like a suicide, using your own rope to tie you to the crime, should anyone look too closely. The cold, calculated cruelty of it stole Wyatt's breath. They hadn't just killed her. They had tried to murder her memory, to paint her as weak and unstable. They had used his home, his dream, as their slaughterhouse. "Higgins has an alibi," Wyatt said, the words tasting like ash. "Alibis are for show," Pike said, a glint of steel in his eyes. "The man we want is the one who drove the wagon. He's the key. Higgins is the head of the snake, but this man was its fangs. We find him, we make him talk, and we bring the whole rotten enterprise crashing down." For the first time since he'd found her, Wyatt felt a surge of something other than grief or rage. It was a cold, clear sense of purpose. He was no longer a lone man fighting shadows. He had a partner, and they had a hunt to begin. The alliance between Wyatt Coleman and Leland Pike was one of grim, unspoken understanding. Wyatt, with his intimate knowledge of the land and its people, was the eyes and ears. Pike, with his sharp, analytical mind and the authority of the Pinkerton Agency, was the brain and the badge. Their first stop was the telegraph office. Pike composed a lengthy coded message to his headquarters in Chicago, outlining the connection between Thorne and Higgins and requesting any information on known associates or hired guns operating in the territory. While they waited for a reply, they focused on the wagon driver. He'd be a stranger, but not so much of one that he'd draw attention, Pike reasoned, pacing the small hotel room he'd rented. Higgins would use one of his own men, but not a foreman. Someone disposable. A low-level wrangler, a man who drifts from ranch to ranch, whose absence for a day or two wouldn't be noticed. Wyatt's mind sifted through the dozens of men who worked for the Higgins Cattle Company. Most were just anonymous cowboys, but a few faces stood out. "There's a man," Wyatt said slowly, an image forming in his mind. "Goes by the name of Webb. Frank Webb. Quiet man, keeps to himself. I've seen him in town a few times. He was at the saloon the day I confronted Higgins standing in the back, just watching." "Describe him," Pike ordered. "Average height, wiry, got a scar that splits his left eyebrow, and he chews tobacco, always." Pike made a note in a small leather-bound book. "It's a start. Let's pay another visit to your friend at the saloon." Maeve O'Connell's eyes widened slightly when Wyatt walked in with the well-dressed stranger, but she kept her composure. Pike ordered coffee and laid out his credentials. Maeve, who had little love for Higgins, was more than willing to cooperate. "Frank Webb," she said, polishing a glass. "Oh, I know him. A nasty piece of work. Never says more than 2 words, just sits and spits tobacco juice into a spittoon. Comes in, has 2 beers and leaves. But he's one of Higgins's men through and through. Been working for him for about 6 months." "Was he here 2 days ago?" Pike asked. "The day of the murder?" Maeve's brow furrowed in concentration. "No," she said definitively. "He wasn't. Higgins and his foreman were at their usual table making a racket, but Webb wasn't with them. Now that you mention it, I didn't see him at all that day." It was another piece of the puzzle. Higgins had his public alibi, while his hired man was free to carry out the wet work. Their investigation hit a wall for the next 24 hours. Webb seemed to have vanished. Wyatt rode a wide perimeter around the Higgins ranch, watching from the ridges, but saw no sign of the man. Pike made discreet inquiries in town, but no one had seen him. The break came in the form of a telegram. Pike returned from the telegraph office, his face set in a grim line. "Our man has a history," he said, handing the decoded message to Wyatt. "Frank Webb is an alias. His real name is William Vance." Wyatt's eyes scanned the page. Vance was a former Union Army scout, dishonorably discharged for brutality. He'd worked as a strikebreaker in the Pennsylvania coal mines and was a wanted man in Colorado for killing a claim jumper. The last line of the telegram made Wyatt's blood run cold. Subject is an expert in infiltration and silent disposal, known to favor the use of garrotes and ropes. "It's him," Wyatt breathed. "And there's more," Pike said, tapping the paper. "Our sources confirm large payments from Thorne's accounts to a bank in Cheyenne, which were then withdrawn in cash by a man matching Higgins's description. The final payment was made last week." They had the motive, the method, and the man, but their killer was in the wind. "Higgins has him hidden," Wyatt surmised. "He's keeping him laid low until the heat dies down, then he'll send him on his way." "Or," Pike countered, "he's already disposed of his disposable man. Vance is a loose end. A man like Higgins doesn't like loose ends." A cold dread filled Wyatt. If Vance was dead, the direct link to Higgins would be gone forever. They had to find him, and find him now. Wyatt thought back to his surveillance of the Higgins ranch. It was a massive operation, with dozens of line shacks and outbuildings spread over thousands of acres. "There's an old abandoned homestead on the far northern edge of Higgins's property," Wyatt said, an idea forming. "The old Miller place. The cabin is barely standing, but the well is still good. It's isolated. If I were to hide a man, that's where I'd put him." It was a long shot, but it was the only one they had. They rode out under the cover of dusk, avoiding the main trails, and are cutting across the open country that Wyatt knew like the back of his hand. The moon was a sliver in the sky, offering little light. They tethered their horses in a thicket of cottonwood trees, a half-mile from the old Miller place, and proceeded on foot. The homestead was a dark, skeletal ruin against the skyline. The cabin's roof had partially collapsed, and the corrals had long since rotted away. It looked deserted. But then Wyatt saw it, a faint, flickering yellow light barely visible through a chink in the cabin's decrepit walls. Someone was inside. Pike drew his Colt revolver, the click of the hammer startlingly loud in the immense quiet of the prairie. Wyatt unholstered his own peacemaker, the cold steel, a familiar and deadly weight in his hand. They crept forward, using the shadows of the crumbling outbuildings for cover until they were pressed against the cabin wall. Inside, they could hear a man humming softly to himself. Peeking through a crack in the logs, Wyatt saw him. It was Frank Webb. He was sitting at a crude table, cleaning his rifle by the light of a single lantern. A half-eaten plate of beans and bacon sat beside him. He was waiting, biding his time. "On my signal," Pike whispered, his voice barely audible. "We go in hard and fast. We need him alive." Wyatt nodded, his heart pounding a frantic rhythm against his ribs. This was it. This was the man who had put his hands on Catherine, the man who had stolen his future and desecrated his home. Rage, cold and pure, settled over him, sharpening his senses. He took a deep breath, the cool night air doing little to quell the fire in his veins. Justice was on the other side of that door. Pike held up 3 fingers, then slowly folded them down. 1, 2. On 3, Wyatt kicked the door. The rotten wood splintered and flew inward with a crash. They stormed the cabin in a whirlwind of motion. "Federal agent, drop it, Vance!" Pike yelled, his voice a commanding crack in the night. Webb Vance moved with inhuman speed. He wasn't startled. He was a cornered wolf. Instead of dropping his rifle, he swept the lantern off the table with its barrel, plunging the cabin into absolute darkness. He fired a single shot, the muzzle flash, a blinding yellow flower that illuminated his snarling face for a split second. The bullet whizzed past Wyatt's ear and buried itself in the log wall behind him. Wyatt dove to the floor as Pike returned fire, his shots aimed at the last place he'd seen the gunman. Wood splintered. A pan clattered to the floor. "He's heading for the back," Wyatt yelled, scrambling in the pitch black. He heard a crash as Vance kicked out a rotted section of the rear wall and scrambled into the night. Wyatt was right behind him, bursting out into the pale moonlight. He saw Vance sprinting towards the crumbling remains of a stone well about 50 yards away. "He's not running away," Pike shouted, emerging from the cabin behind Wyatt. "He's running to cover." They gave chase, their boots pounding the dry earth. Vance reached the low stone wall of the well and spun around, firing again. Wyatt and Pike dropped to the ground, the shot singing over their heads. They were pinned down in the open. "We need to flank him," Pike yelled, firing a shot to keep Vance's head down. "I'll draw his fire," Wyatt shouted back. He knew this was reckless, but the cold rage inside him had burned away all fear. He got to his feet in a crouch and zigzagged to the left, towards a pile of fallen timbers from the old barn. As he expected, Vance turned his attention to him. A bullet tore through the sleeve of Wyatt's shirt, a hot kiss of death. Another kicked up dirt by his feet. But it was the opening Pike needed. The detective sprinted to the right, using the blind spot created by the cabin to circle around. Wyatt reached the timbers and took cover, his breath coming in ragged gasps. He peered over the top. Vance was hunkered down behind the well reloading. Wyatt raised his peacemaker, took careful aim, and squeezed the trigger. His shot struck the stone wall just inches from Vance's head, showering him with chips of rock. Vance cursed and ducked back down. The standoff was tense, the silence broken only by the chirping of crickets and the ragged sound of their own breathing. Then from behind, the well came a new sound. A grunt, the thud of a fist hitting flesh, and a clatter as a rifle hit the stone. Pike had reached him. Wyatt rushed forward, his gun ready. He saw Pike and Vance locked in a desperate struggle. Vance was a wiry, brutal fighter, landing a solid punch to Pike's jaw that sent the detective staggering back. Vance lunged not for his rifle but for a knife at his belt. Wyatt didn't hesitate. He didn't shout a warning. He closed the distance and brought the heavy barrel of his Colt down on the back of Vance's head. The gunman crumpled to the ground without a sound. Pike straightened up, rubbing his jaw and spitting a stream of blood into the dust. "Thanks for the timely intervention," he managed. They bound Vance's hands and feet with the rope from his own bedroll. As the first grey light of dawn began to creep over the horizon, he started to stir, groaning. Wyatt knelt down, his face inches from the killer's. Vance's eyes fluttered open, filled with hate and confusion. Her name was Catherine Gable. Wyatt said, his voice a low, menacing growl. "She came here for a new life. I want to hear you say why you took it from her." Vance just spat at him. "Go to hell, rancher." Pike stepped forward. "William Vance, you're a wanted man in 3 territories. You're going to hang. The only question is how much company you have on the gallows. You can protect Higgins and swing alone, or you can talk and maybe the judge will listen." Vance's eyes darted between them. He was a rat in a trap, and he knew it. He remained silent, but the flicker of fear in his eyes was answer enough. They dragged him back to Prairie Ridge as the sun was rising a grim procession of justice. They marched him directly into the sheriff's office, where Brody Kent, who had been woken by the sound of their arrival, stared in disbelief. Vance, facing the certainty of the noose, and with no loyalty to the man who would have likely killed him anyway, confessed everything. He told them how Higgins had hired him on Thorne's orders. He described intercepting Catherine's private wagon, a decoy hired by the Pinkertons, which Vance had ambushed, and convincing her he was taking her to Wyatt's homestead early. He recounted the murder in cold, detached detail and confirmed that Higgins himself had provided the location, the rope, and the bottle of expensive Irish whiskey to plant at the scene. Sheriff Kent, flanked by Pike and a stunned Deputy Riley, arrested Bart Higgins on the porch of his own hotel in front of the whole town. The cattle baron, stripped of his power, and his alibi bellowed and threatened, but his threats were empty. The fangs of the snake had been pulled, and they had pointed directly back to the head. Wyatt didn't stay to watch. He rode out of town, leaving the noise and the whispers behind. He rode back to his claim to the silent cabin on Coyote Creek. He stopped at the crest of the hill overlooking his home. Justice had been served. The conspiracy was broken. But the victory felt hollow. Down below the cabin stood bathed in the clean morning light. The second rocking chair was still on the porch. The table inside was still set for two. He had his land. He had his justice. But his home was just a house again, and the silence had returned deeper and more profound than ever before. He was still the lone rancher, and in his heart he knew he would be waiting for his bride for the rest of his days. The story of Wyatt Coleman and Catherine Gable is a stark reminder that the Wild West was more than just a place of opportunity. It was a crucible of violent ambition and heartbreaking loss. It shows how the long arm of corruption could stretch from the boardrooms of the East to the most isolated homesteads, and how justice often depended on the courage of ordinary men forced into extraordinary circumstances. Wyatt's quest wasn't just for revenge. It was a fight to reclaim the memory of a woman he never met and to honor the future they were supposed to share. His victory was a lonely one, a testament to the harsh truth that even when justice prevails, it can't always mend a broken heart. If this story of frontier justice and tragic loss resonated with you, please take a moment to support our channel. Hit that like button, share this video with someone who appreciates a powerful Western tale, and most importantly, subscribe and ring the bell so you won't miss our next story from the untamed heart of the American West. Your support allows us to keep these forgotten histories alive. Thank you for listening.